The General Diet of Poland enjoys, as I have before observed, the supreme authority. It declares war, makes peace, levies soldiers, enters into alliances, imposes taxes, enacts laws. In a word, it exercises all the rights of absolute sovereignty. Some historians place the earliest Diet in the reign of Casimir the Great, but it is very uncertain whether it was first convened in his time, and still more doubtful of what members it consisted. Thus much is unquestionable that it was not until the reign of Casimir III that this National Assembly was modelled into its present form. The place of holding the diets depended formally upon the will of the kings, and Louis even summoned two in Hungary. In those early times, Petrikau was the town in which they were most frequently assembled. But in 1569, at the union of Poland and Lithuania, Warsaw was appointed the place of meeting, and in 1673 it was enacted that of 3 successive diets, 2 should be held in this capital and 1 at Grodno in Lithuania. This regulation has been generally followed until the reign of His present Majesty, when the assemblies have been uniformly summoned to Warsaw. Diets are ordinary and extraordinary. The former are convened every 2 years, the latter as occasion requires. In 1717, the usual season for the meeting of the ordinary diets was fixed for Michaelmas, but during the present reign it has been occasionally changed to the month of October or November. The king, with the advice of the Permanent Council, convokes the diet by means of circular letters issued to all the palatines in their respective provinces, at least 6 weeks before the time appointed for its meeting. These letters are accompanied with a short sketch of the business to be agitated in the diet. The constituent parts of the diet are the 3 estates of the realm, namely the king, the senate, and the nobles or gentry, by their nuncios or representatives. The king, considered in his capacity of president, is only as it were the chief of the diet. He subscribes all acts, signs all decrees agreed to by the assembly, issues out all ordinances in his own name and that of the republic, without enjoying the right of a negative in any of those particulars. He has no vote excepting upon an equality of suffrages, but is at liberty to deliver his sentiments upon all questions. His present Majesty is esteemed one of the most eloquent among the Polish orators. He has an agreeable tone of voice and much skill in suiting and varying his cadence to the subjects of his discourse. He harangues with great energy of style and dignity of manner, and his speeches always make a considerable impression upon the members of the diet. When he is disposed to speak, he rises from his seat, advances a few steps, and cries out, "I summon the ministers of state to the throne." Then the great officers of the crown, who are sitting at the lower end of the Senate House, come forward and stand near the king. The 4 great marshals strike the ground at the same time with their staffs of office, and the first in rank says, "The king is going to speak," after which His Majesty begins. 2. The second estate, or the Senate, is composed of spiritual and temporal senators. 1. The bishops or senators spiritual have the precedence over the temporal senators. The Archbishop of Gniezno is primate and chief of the Senate, and viceroy in case of an interregnum. 2. The temporal are palatines, castellans, and the great officers of state. The palatines are the governors of the provinces, who hold their offices for life. In time of war, when the army of the Republic is summoned, the palatines levy and lead the force of their palatinates into the field, according to the tenure of feudal services. In time of peace, they convoke the assemblies of the palatinates, preside in the county courts of justice, and judge the Jews within their respective jurisdictions, etc. The castellans are divided into grand and petty castellans. Their office in time of peace is merely nominal, but when the military or feudal services are required, they are the lieutenants of the palatines, under whom they command the troops of the several districts in the palatinates. The ministers of state who sit in the Senate are 16 in number, namely the 2 great marshals of Poland and Lithuania, the 2 sub-marshals, the 2 great chancellors, the 2 vice-chancellors, the 2 great generals, the 2 little generals, the 2 great treasurers, and the 2 sub-treasurers. All the senators were formally appointed by the king, but by the late change of government, His Majesty's choice is restricted to one of 3 candidates presented by the Permanent Council. The senators, once nominated, cannot be deprived of their charges, excepting by the Diet. 3. The third estate is formed by the nuncios or representatives of the equestrian order. These representatives are chosen in the dietines or assemblies of each palatinate, in which every noble or gentleman, at the age of 18, has a vote or is capable of being elected. There is no qualification in point of property required, either for the electors or elected. It is only necessary that the nuncio should be a noble, that is, a person not engaged in trade or commerce, possessing land himself, or the son of a person possessing land, or of an ancient family which formerly possessed land. Each nuncio must be 23 years of age. The general proceedings of the Diet are as follow. The king, senate, and nuncios first meet all together in the cathedral of Warsaw, and hear mass and a sermon. After service, the members of the Senate or upper house repair to the Senate house, and the nuncios or lower house to their chamber, when the latter choose by a majority of voices a marshal or speaker of the equestrian order. In order to preclude unnecessary delays, the election is required to take place within 3 days after their meeting. 2 days after the choice of their speaker, the king, senate, and nuncios assemble in the Senate house, which is called the junction of the two houses. The nuncios then kiss the king's hand, and the members of the Diet take their places in the following order. The king is seated in regal state upon a raised throne, under a canopy at the upper end of the apartment. At the lower end, opposite the throne, sit in armchairs the ministers of state. The bishops, palatines, and castellans are ranged in 3 rows of armed chairs, extending from the throne on each side, and behind these are placed the nuncios upon benches covered with red cloth. The senators have the privilege of wearing their caps, but the nuncios remain uncovered. All the members being seated, the pacta conventa are read. When the speaker of the equestrian order, as well as each nuncio, is empowered to interrupt the perusal by remonstrating against the infringement of any particular article, and demanding at the same time a redress of grievances. Then the great chancellor proposes in the king's name the questions to be taken into consideration, after which his majesty nominates 3 senators and the speaker 6 nuncios to prepare the bills. The Diet, by majority of voices, chooses a committee to examine the accounts of the treasury. The members of the permanent council are elected in the manner mentioned in the preceding chapter. These preliminary transactions ought to be dispatched in the space of 3 weeks, at which period the two houses separate, the nuncios retire into their own chamber, and all the bills undergo a separate discussion in both houses. Those which relate to the treasury are approved or rejected by the sentiments of the majority. But in all state matters plus of the highest importance, no resolution of the Diet is valid, unless ratified by the unanimous assent of every nuncio, each of whom is able to suspend all proceedings by his exertion of the Liberum Veto. The Diet must not sit longer than 6 weeks. On the first day, therefore, of the 6th week, the Senate and nuncios meet again in the Senate House. The state bills, provided they are unanimously agreed to by the nuncios, an event which seldom happens in a free Diet, are passed into laws, but if that unanimity be wanting to them, they stand rejected, and the business relating to the treasury, which has been carried by a majority, is read and registered. At the conclusion of the 6th week, the laws which have passed are signed by the speaker and nuncios, and the Diet is of course dissolved. The extraordinary Diets are subject to the same regulations as the ordinary Diets, with this difference, that they cannot, by the constitutions of 1768, continue longer than a fortnight. The same day in which the two houses assemble in the Senate House, the questions are to be laid before them, and the nuncios return immediately to their own chamber. On the 13th day from their first meeting, the two houses are again united, and on the 15th day after the laws have been read and signed, the Diet breaks up as usual. The most extraordinary characteristic in the constitution of Poland, and which seems peculiarly to distinguish this government from all others, both in ancient and modern times, is the Liberum Veto, or the power which each nuncio enjoys in a free Diet, not only like the tribunes of antient Rome, of putting a negative upon any law, but even of dissolving the assembly. That every member of a numerous society should be invested with such a dangerous privilege in the midst of the most important national transactions is a circumstance in itself so incredible as to deserve a minute inquiry into the causes which introduced a custom so pregnant with anarchy, and so detrimental to public welfare. The privilege in question is not to be found in any period of the Polish history antecedent to the reign of John Casimir. It was under his administration that in the year 1652, when the Diet of Warsaw was debating upon transactions of the utmost importance which required a speedy determination, that Sisinski, nuncio of Upita in Lithuania, cried out, "I stop the proceedings." Having uttered these words, he quitted the assembly, and repairing immediately to the Chancellor, protested that as many acts had been proposed and carried contrary to the constitution of the Republic, if the Diet continued to sit, he should consider it as an infringement of the laws. The members were thunderstruck at a protest of this nature, hitherto unknown. Warm debates took place about the propriety of continuing or dissolving the Diet. At length, however, the venal and discontented faction who supported the protest obtained the majority, and the assembly broke up in great confusion. This transaction changed entirely the constitution of Poland and gave an unlimited scope to misrule and faction. The causes which induced the Poles to acquiesce in establishing the Liberum Veto, thus casually introduced, were probably the following. 1. It was the interest of the great officers of state, particularly the great general, the great treasurer, and great marshal, in whose hands were vested the administration of the army, the finances, and the police, to abridge the sitting of the Diet. These great officers of state, being once nominated by the king, enjoyed their appointments for life, totally independent of his authority, and liable to no control during the intervals of the Diets, to which alone they were responsible. This powerful body accordingly strongly espoused the Liberum Veto, conscious that they could easily, and at all times, secure a nuncio to protest, and by that means elude all inquiry into their administration. 2. By a fundamental law of the Republic, nobles accused of certain capital crimes could only be brought to trial before the Diet, and as at the period just mentioned many persons stood under that description, all these and their adherents naturally favoured an expedient tending to dissolve the only tribunal by which they could be convicted and punished. 3. The exigencies of the state, occasioned by the continual wars in which Poland had been engaged, demanded at this particular crisis an imposition of several heavy taxes, and as the sole power of levying all pecuniary aids resided in the Diet, all the nuncios who opposed the raising of additional subsidies seconded the proposal for shortening the duration of that assembly. 4. But the principal reason which carried through and afterwards supported the power of dissolving Diets is to be derived from the influence of some of the great neighbouring powers, interested to foment anarchy and confusion in the Polish councils. Before this period, if they wished to form a cabal and to carry any point in the National Assembly, they were obliged to secure a majority of votes. Under the new arrangement, they were able to attain their end on much easier terms, and to put an end to any Diet unfriendly to their views by the corruption of a single member. The bad effects of the Liberum Veto were soon felt by the nation to such an alarming degree that all the members in the Diet of 1670 bound themselves by an oath not to exert it, and even passed a resolution that it should be entirely void of effect during the continuance of that meeting. Notwithstanding, however, these salutary precautions, one Zabokryski nuncio from the Palatinate of Bratlau, interposing his negative, brought this very Diet to a premature dissolution. This Liberum Veto, indeed, has been always considered by the most intelligent Poles as one of the principal causes which has contributed to the decline of their country. From the era of its establishment, public business has continually suffered the most fatal interruption. It abruptly broke up 7 Diets in the reign of John Casimir, 4 under Michael, 7 under John Sobieski, and 30 during the reigns of the 2 Augusti, so that, within the space of 112 years, 48 Diets have been precipitately dissolved by its operation, during which period Poland has continued almost without laws, without justice, and excepting the reign of John Sobieski, with few symptoms of military vigor. Yet so strongly did the motives above displayed attach the Poles to this pernicious privilege, that in the Act of Confederacy, framed in 1696, after the decease of John Sobieski, the Liberum Veto is called the dearest and most invaluable palladium of Polish liberty. The Poles, however, having fatally experienced the disorders arising from the Liberum Veto, would certainly have abolished it if they had not been prevented by the partitioning powers, and it still exists in its full force. It should be observed that neither the king nor the Senate, but only the nuncios, enjoy the power of interposing this negative upon the proceedings of the Diet. It will naturally strike the reader that if every representative possesses the Liberum Veto, how can any transaction be carried on? Or how is it possible that any one bill should pass into a law? For no motion can be conceived which is not liable to be opposed by the intrigues of party or the jealousy of the neighboring powers. In order, therefore, to avoid the anarchy attendant upon free diets through the operation of the Liberum Veto, the Poles have lately had recourse to diets by confederacy, which, though composed of the same members and held under the same exterior forms as free diets, differ from them in the essential circumstance of allowing business to be determined by the plurality of votes. These diets have long been known to the Constitution and have at times been used upon extraordinary emergencies, but within these 10 years they have been regularly held at the stated time for summoning ordinary diets. Indeed, according to the true principles of the Polish government, no confederacy ought to be entered into, excepting upon the following occasions: in defense of the king's person, upon any foreign invasion or domestic conspiracy, and during an interregnum at the diets of convocation and election. But as no other means have been found to prevent perpetual anarchy, the nation is obliged to submit to an infringement of the Constitution, which operates for the general good plus. Diet of election. During my continuance at Warsaw, I visited the spot where the kings of Poland are chosen. I was so fortunate as to be accompanied by a nobleman of the Senate, who obligingly explained all the forms and ceremonies of the election and answered all the questions which my curiosity suggested to me upon the occasion. Immediately upon my return to Warsaw, while the impression was yet warm upon my memory, I noted down the following account of the place and mode of election. I was more circumstantial than usual, as well because the subject is interesting, as because most of the descriptions which I have read of this ceremony abound with errors. The spot which is settled by the Constitution for the place of election is the plain of Vola, about 3 miles from the capital. In the midst of this plain are 2 enclosures of ground, one for the Senate and the other for the nuncios. The former is of an oblong shape, surrounded by a kind of rampart or ditch, in the midst of which is erected at the time of election a temporary building of wood called sopa, covered at top and open at the sides. Near it is the other enclosure for the nuncios, of a circular shape, from which it derives its name of cola or circle, within which there is no building erected, the nuncios assembling in the open air. When the 2 chambers are joined, they meet within the cola, the senators' chairs and the benches for the nuncios being ranged in the same regular order as in the Senate House at Warsaw, while the seat of the primate is placed in the middle. The sopa is always pulled down at the conclusion of the election, so that I could only trace the site of the enclosures, the ramparts of earth remaining in the same state. I had an opportunity, however, of seeing a painting representing the sopa and whole scene of election which, as I was informed, was perfectly accurate. But before I describe the election, it may be necessary to give a short detail of the principal occurrences which precede that ceremony. Upon the king's demise, the interregnum commences. The regal authority is then vested in the Archbishop of Gniezno, primate of Poland, as interrex or regent. He announces the death of the king by circular letters, convokes the dietines and diets of convocation, and in a word, performs all the functions of royalty during the vacancy in the throne. The diet, which is first convened upon the sovereign's decease, is called the Diet of Convocation, and is always held at Warsaw previous to the Diet of Election, which assembles in the plain of Vola. The sovereign authority resides in this assembly, in the same manner as in those which are summoned while the throne is filled. The primate presides like the king, with this difference that he does not place himself upon the throne, but sits in an armed chair stationed in the middle of the Senate House. The Diet issues out acts or ordinances, arranges or changes the form of government, settles the pacta conventa, and appoints the meeting of the Diet of Election. The interval between the death of the king and the nomination of his successor is uncertain, its longer or shorter duration depending upon the intrigues and cabals of the candidates or the pleasure of those foreign powers who give law to Poland. It is always a state of turbulence and licentiousness. The kingdom is divided into parties and factions. Justice is in a manner suspended, and the nobles commit every disorder with impunity. Unanimity being requisite in all matters of state, it is easy to conceive the delays and cabals, the influence and corruption employed to gain the members in the Diet of Convocation. As soon as all the points are adjusted, whether the acts have passed unanimously or otherwise, the members, previous to their separation, enter into a general confederacy to support and maintain the resolutions of the Diet. At the appointed day, the Diet of Election is assembled, during which Warsaw and its environs is a scene of confusion and frequently of bloodshed. The chief nobility have large bodies of troops in their service, and repair to the Diet attended by their numerous vassals and a large retinue of domestics, while each petty baron, who can afford to maintain them, parades about with his retainers and slaves. On the day in which the Diet of Election is opened, the primate, senate, and nobility repair to the cathedral of Warsaw to hear mass and a sermon, from whence they proceed in due order to the plain of Vola. The senators enter the sopa, and the nuncios take their places within the cola, while the other nobles are stationed in the plain. The Senate and the nuncios, after having passed their respective resolutions, as in the ordinary diets, assemble together in the cola, when the primate, seated in the middle, lays before them the objects to be taken into consideration. The pacta conventa, settled at the Diet of Convocation, are read and approved, all necessary arrangements made, and the day of election appointed. The Diet then gives audience to the foreign ministers, who are permitted by recommendation to interfere in the choice of a king, and to the advocates of the several candidates. All these affairs take up several days, and would perhaps never be terminated, as unanimity is requisite, if the assembly was not overawed by the foreign troops, who are always quartered near the plain of election. Upon the day appointed for the election, the Senate and nuncios assemble as before in the cola, while the nobles are ranged in the open field in separate bodies, according to their several palatinates, with standards borne before them, and the principal officers of each district on horseback. The primate, having declared the names of the candidates, kneels down and chants a hymn, after which the senators and nuncios join the gentry of their respective palatinates. Then the primate, on horseback or in a carriage, goes round the plain to the different bodies of the gentry as they are stationed according to their palatinates, and having collected the votes, proclaims the successful candidate. Each noble does not give his vote separately, for that would be endless. But when the primate goes round, the collective body of each palatinate name the person they espouse. At the conclusion of this ceremony, the assembly breaks up. On the following day, the Senate and nuncios return to the plain. The successful candidate is again proclaimed, and a deputy dispatched to acquaint him of his election, as no candidate is allowed to be present. After the proclamation, the gentry retire, and the Diet, having appointed the Diet of Coronation, is dissolved. All elections are contested, not indeed upon the spot, for the terror of a neighboring army has for some time past forced the nobles to appear unanimous. But the party who dissent retiring from the plain remonstrate, and if they are sufficiently strong, a civil war ensues. Indeed, the confusion, disorder, and bloodshed which formerly attended these popular elections would still be renewed, if it were not for the interference of foreign troops. And thus, the country draws some advantage from an evil which is considered by the Poles as the disgrace and scandal of every election.